Evening. Today we're going to be thinking about Masala Shakespeare, and just to prove that I'm not a North Indian chauvinist, there we go. Egadera. So I should say from the outset, going to be focusing on Hindi cinema and its relation to Shakespeare, so apologies in advance for the area of chauvinism. But this may strike you as a little bit counterintuitive. What does Shakespeare have to do with Hindi cinema? There's Shakespeare, there's Bollywood. There seems to be absolutely nothing in common. Dour, black and white, colorful, over the top. Well, what I want to argue today is that despite the fact that Shakespeare and Bollywood seem to have nothing in common other than abnormally oversized collars, Shakespeare always was Indian and has been Indian for quite some time. Of course, the Bengalis know this because everything that happens in India happens first in Bengal. Shakespeare Sharani in the center of Kolkata, as any Bengali knows, or anyone from Kolkata knows, is one of the landmarks of the city. And in politics, Shakespeare has an extraordinary presence across the spectrum in India. So, a famous Bengali who knows a thing or two about Shakespeare Sharani, Pranab Da, he said when he was Minister of Finance that he must be cruel to be kind. There he's quoting Hamlet. The famous Shakespearean critic and Bahu, and now Minister of Textiles, when she tried to denounce her opponents, she said they think that fair is foul and foul is fair. I'm not sure if she knew that she was quoting Macbeth's witches. And Sitaram Yechuri from the Communist Party, when talking about sanitation issues in India, also quoted Macbeth, all the perfumes of Arabia will not remove the stain. But it's not in politics or even in English that Shakespeare's footprints are largest in the subcontinent. It's in film. And again, to prove that I'm not North Indian chauvinist, here are a bunch of films in Telugu, Kannada, Tamil, Malayalam that are conversations with, directly inspired by Shakespeare's plays. You may not know, but there's a cottage industry of reworkings of Taming of the Shrew from Gundamakatha in Telugu through several Kannada versions from the 60s, 70s, and 80s to one from Tamil Nadu in about 1970, featuring Jaya Lalita as the shrew. That's at the bottom right. But it's in Bollywood, in Hindi cinema, that Shakespeare's presence has been most felt. And the selection that I've got up here barely scrapes the surface. So you might think that the presence of Shakespeare in India has everything to do with the long shadow still cast by colonialism, and in particular, Thomas Macaulay's mission of colonizing Indians culturally by telling us that the literature from the subcontinent cannot hold a candle to even a bookshelf of English literature. And Shakespeare was vital to this mission for Macaulay in culturally colonizing India. But that project of colonialism cannot alone explain why Shakespeare has been so phenomenally popular here. I'd say there's one ingredient that links Shakespeare to Hindi cinema, and that's masala. I'm not speaking about the actual spices, I'm speaking about the idea of masala. Masala is a mixture. We may not think it now, but Shakespeare was a purveyor, even a poet of mixture. He was, after all, writing for both a high and a low audience. He wrote in poetry and prose. His tragedies are also comedies. Hamlet has clowns. His comedies are also tragedies. He likes mixing things up stylistically as well. We may not think this way, but Shakespeare's plays are full of item numbers, full of songs. Every performance of a Shakespeare play would finish with what was called a burger mask, where all the characters would spring up, even if they died, and this is particularly disarming when we have a play like Hamlet, where pretty much everyone is a corpse at the end. They all spring up at the end and start dancing a burger mask. This is only part, as we'll see, of what linked Shakespeare to Hindi cinema. But I want us to explore a little bit more what masala means. And I think it's particularly important to explore it on a day like today, when we have seen a verdict coming from the apex court of the country, that arguably is an argument against mixture. So Munshi Premchand argued that for any story to be successful in India, it has to have masala. We don't know quite what he means by that, but it's worth reflecting on the fact that Munshi Premchand, even though he is known as a Hindi writer, wrote originally in Urdu. At least his early stories he wrote in Nastaliq script. And it's perhaps more accurate to say that Premchand's stories are written in Hindustani, a mixture of Hindi and Urdu. After all, one of the things that is most stunning about the subcontinent is the incredible wealth, plurality of languages. And it's not just that there are many languages in separate tracts, in separate states. It's also that virtually every one of us, when we speak, swerve between languages. How many of you have had the experience of starting a thought in one language and finishing it in another? Right? Virtually everyone here. I may be speaking to you in English, but you'll see other languages are going to come out in the wash, and you won't miss a beat because you're used to that. I'm sure in Bangalore you move between English, Kannada, Hindi, other languages as well. This is true of virtually any part of the subcontinent. Hindi cinema, when it started, was like Shakespeare's theatre, playing to a mixed audience. Mixed economically, high and low, mixed culturally, religiously, linguistically. And this is why the Hindi cinema that appeared in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s was not should Hindi. One of the big myths about Hindi cinema is that it's actually in Hindi. It's not. It swerves between Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi increasingly, Bhojpuri. And we see it in the posters for classic films from the 50s, like Mother India. It was standard at this time that the opening credits for a film would be not in one but three languages. The title would be in three separate scripts: Latin, Devanagari, and Nastaliq, as we see with Mother India. This plurality of language is somehow crucial to the idea of India that Nargis represents here. And this masala, this multi-communal, multi-linguistic masala, carried on into the classic masala movies of the 70s. We may think of masala movies now as simply escapist entertainment, but I think the term masala, as an adjective for masala movies, points to a politics that we often forget about these films. They're profoundly syncretic and pluralistic, not just in their style, with their mixture of dishum and nach gana and realistic and tragic and comic, but also in terms of their vision of an India where, despite bichte bhai hue, these brothers are Muslim, Christian, Hindu, in the case of Amar Akbar Antony. The film is also multilingual, as you will remember from my name is Anthony Gonzalez, main dunya mein akela hoon. And when he calls himself a kismat wali, he's not speaking Hindi as such. He's swerving into Urdu. This Goan Christian brother of a Muslim and a Hindu is himself triple, multiple masala. And well into the 21st century, Hindi films with their nach gana sequences and their plethora of styles remained multilingual. We see it even as recently as just a few years ago in this film, Ye Javani Hai Divani, which involves item numbers in Urdu, involving characters that are supposedly Hindu. The opening scene with Madhuri Dixit and Ranbir is set in a kota in Agra. There are all sorts of sort of cheap puns on via Agra, Viagra, etc. Almost Shakespearean in their wordplay. But the point is, once again, this is a multilingual, multi-communal imagining of India. I think it's no coincidence that in recent years this type of film has been disappearing. We're seeing increasingly niche films for singular audiences, singular demographics. Now, what does this have to do with Shakespeare? Shakespeare plays a very vital part in the history of Hindi cinema. The very first talkie in Hindi cinema was this, Saurabh Modi, the Parsi theatre director's film adaptation of his Urdu adaptation of Hamlet, which features characters, including Saurabh Modi playing Hamlet in doublet and hose, but they break for item numbers and 17 Urdu songs. Saurabh Modi was so enamored of what he was able to do that the next year he repeated the experiment with a film called Sayed-e-Havas, Lust Stories, which was an adaptation of Shakespeare's little-known play King John. And Shakespeare has remained in the Hindi cinema film DNA ever since. Whether it's Gulzar's extraordinary film Angur, which is its own sort of first cousin once removed of Amar Akbar Antony, again a Bichte Bhai Hue story, but it's a version of Comedy of Errors. Sharat Kataria's film Ten Mil Love, an adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dream. Vishal Bhardwaj's acclaimed trilogy, which I'm sure you're familiar with, adaptations of Macbeth, Othello, and Hamlet, and a never-ending slew of adaptations of Romeo and Juliet. In fact, it's arguable that Hindi cinema would not exist without Romeo and Juliet. Punjabi cinema, by the way, the biggest grossing film of all time, gross in every sense of the word, is an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet called Jat and Juliet. In typical Punjabi style, it ends happily, rather than tragically, in Canada. Provoking thereby something unheard of in Romeo and Juliet tradition, a sequel, Jat and Juliet 2, where for reasons only known to the producers, this Romeo and Juliet become policemen. But I want to speak about Romeo and Juliet a little bit more to understand how this is in some ways the archetypal Masala play, and maybe that's why the Shakespearean critic Yogi Adityanath is not very fond of it and has set up anti-Romeo squads in Uttar Pradesh. Romeo and Juliet is a play about Masala love. Let's not forget that it's a play about characters, young lovers from different communities, feuding communities. Their love is a forbidden one, forbidden by Pitaji and Mataji. And the tragedy is to a certain extent the result of the mother and father's position that love between communities is unacceptable. But this is a play also about Masala language. Romeo and Juliet is a play that is full of puns. And something I want to argue is that cultures that pun aren't simply randomly interested in puns. Cultures that pun love puns because they speak many languages. And a word in one language can sound identical to a word in another language, but mean something completely different. Now, let me tell you something a little bit counterintuitive and controversial, given that we now worship Shakespeare as the Devta of the English language. Shakespeare didn't write in English. And the reason for that is English did not yet exist as a formalized language. The British Isles were in fact a multicultural zone in which the inhabitants spoke a variety of languages and dialects. So Shakespeare, for instance, grew up speaking a dialect that was heavily Anglo-Saxon. His fellow Englishmen from the north spoke a dialect that was heavily Scandinavian. People from the upper middle classes spoke a dialect that was heavily French. And people who remembered the time of Catholicism before the Protestant Reformation had, if not a speaking knowledge, then at least an understanding of Latin. All these languages were in the mix when Shakespeare wrote. And remember, he was writing for a mixed Masala audience. He had to counter, he had to accommodate all these constituencies. And this is reflected in the puns from Romeo and Juliet. The most famous pun is when Mercutio, Romeo's sidekick, has been fatally stabbed. And even as he is dying, he can't stop himself from punning. Ask for me tomorrow, he says, you will find me a grave man. Ha, ha, ha. A pun, of course, on I'll be serious tomorrow. I won't be punning. He's right about that because he's going to be dead. But also on gravestone. Now, people got this pun because grave meant two different things in two different languages that Shakespeare's audiences were familiar with. Grave in the sense of serious came from the French grave, meaning serious. But grave in the sense of gravestone came from the Germanic and Anglo-Saxon graben, which means to dig up a grave. Shakespeare knew that his audience would be able to carry both languages in their head at the same time. The opening lines of Romeo and Juliet, which are not often remembered, are a startling example of Shakespeare's and his audience's ability with Masala language. The opening 4 lines start with a succession of rapid-fire puns. 2 characters from the Capulet family, that's Juliet's family, they're basically gundas, they're street fighters, gangsters. They come on stage and Samson says, "Gregory, on my word, will not carry coals." Gregory, "No, for then we should be colliers." Samson, "I mean, if we be in collar, we'll draw." Gregory, "I'll, while you live, draw your neck out of the collar." Now you may be saying, what the hell does that mean? And that's probably why these lines are passed over by most people now. But they tell us so much that we need to know about the play, subliminally. Now, let's just gloss these puns. Coals, colliers, collar, collar. To carry coals means to put up with insults. Samson is saying, "Gregory, on my word, will not carry coals." He's a gangster. He's saying, "Yo, bro, no one's going to diss us." Gregory says, "No, for then we should be colliers, carriers of coal." We're not carriers of coal, we're Capulets, we're lords, we're aristocratic despite being gundas. Samson, "I mean, if we be in collar, we'll draw." Collar means angry. So if I'm angry, I'm going to draw. He doesn't mean I'm going to whip out my crayon and draw a picture. I'll whip out my sword and stab the person who disses me. Gregory talks some sense into his head. "While you live, draw your neck out of the collar." Collar meaning not only collar, but also noose, hangman's noose. Don't do anything that will get you executed. Now, what's interesting is that these puns come from 4 different languages that Shakespeare's audience are familiar with. Coal from the German Kohl, meaning coal. Collier from the French collier, meaning a carrier of coal. Collar from the Latin collar, meaning anger. And collar from the Italian collare, meaning collar. Shakespeare presumes that his audience will be able to bounce between all these languages. Does it sound familiar? This is exactly what you all do in your everyday conversation. You may say, "Va va, Shakespeare, are kya baat?" What command of language? This is what you do every day. This is what Shakespeare's audience did every day. And he had to accommodate that. I was thinking the other day of some of the expressions that my students come up with. One came to me and said, "Biti mat de yaar." I said, "Biti? Matlab kya?" "Biti yaar, biti, bad trip. Bad trip mat de yaar, don't give me a bad trip." My students are used to swerving between languages in very inventive ways. And we see this kind of giddy invention in moving between languages in Shakespeare. Now, this is important for the play because it subliminally signposts what the theme of the play is about. For proponents of Shuddhta, German should not mix with French. French should not mix with Italian. Italian should not mix with Latin. All these should be kept separate and pure. But in everyday speech, they aren't kept separate because language never is pure. Language is intrinsically promiscuous. So items that are supposedly divided by walls, by barriers, hook up linguistically, which anticipates exactly the story of Romeo and Juliet. Now, what does this have to do with Hindi cinema? I want to talk about a film, Ishqzade. How many of you have seen Ishqzade? Okay. It's an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet set in the Shakespeare critic Yogi Adityanath's state. And it's the kind of film that would get Yogi Adityanath's hackles raised because it's Romeo is a Hindu and it's Juliet, Joya, is Muslim. Now, very early on in the film, we have an item number that seems to have nothing to do with the rest of the film. Remember, Gregory and Samson's exchange seem to have nothing to do with the rest of Romeo and Juliet, but subliminally, it lays the ground for the story of Masala love that's going to come by hooking up items that are supposedly separate, that shouldn't mix. Ishqzadeh does exactly the same thing with its opening item number, Ishqzadeh's Jhalawala. Now, I'm not going to show you the visuals. I want you to look at the lyrics and tell me what language is this song in? Ishq ka zuban.
जिसका ना जिगर पे लगाए चोट, जिसके जाने से बम फटे, एटम बम हो जाए विस्फोट, आशिकों की है शामत या फत है, चांद बेबी है आई कयामत है। आशिकों में जिसका टाइटल टाइटैनिक, ओ आशिकों में जिसका टाइटल टाइटैनिक, मुआ किनारा दिखा कर डुबा दे गया झल्ला, मेरा आशिक झल्ला बल्ला, मेरा बलमा झल्ला बल्ला, मेरा झल्ला बल्ला बल्ला। हमने समझा था गोल्डन जुबली जिसे, हर समझा हमने था गोल्डन जुबली जिसे, वो तो मैटिनी दिखा करके चुम्मा ले गया झल्ला।
I could listen to that forever, but we don't have all the time in the world, unfortunately. But what language is this song in? It's in a Hindi film. And yes, parts of the song are in Hindi, but they're also in English, Urdu, Persian, Arabic. And what's interesting is we get lots of puns in this song. Some are just within languages, like title, Titanic. But my favorite puns in this song move across languages. My absolute favorite is a teacher. We didn't get to it in this song, but it comes towards the end. Jisko mohabbat ka teacher kehte rahe, wo fat teacher ek lesson mein fail ho gaya. Teachers can be fat teacher, right? Part of the exuberance of the song is the license that its lyricist, Kaushar Munir, supremely talented lyricist, has given herself to swerve from language to language. Something I noticed about India after I moved here many years ago was that what drivers call lane discipline is not something that is really observed and practiced at all when driving on the road here. There are lanes on the road, but they're only notional, right? You've got to keep swerving in order to stay alive. If you stay in one lane, you're going to get smashed up. Now, sometimes I wish that drivers would stick in lanes, but I am so grateful that speakers don't. There is something so exhilaratingly creative, lively, about this ability to keep moving linguistically. And it's not just lively, it models, dare I say, an everyday politics of receptivity to those who are not you. You can move into their space, you can move with them into your space. It's what I call an ethics of linguistic hospitality. This prefaces the story of Parma and Zoya, Romeo and Juliet, and Ishakzadeh, in exactly the same way that Samson and Gregory's punning at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet prefaces Romeo and Juliet's story. But I feel we're losing this right now. We're ever more insistent on shuddha, in our sense of community, in our sense of language, even our sense of entertainment. The rise of view on demand means that we're watching films more and more by ourselves, rather than in single screen cinema halls where we have to sit with people who don't come from our community or class or even speak the same language as us. I think we've got to struggle hard to try and create spaces in which that kind of Masala encounter can still happen. I think Masala Shakespeare is one such space in which it's continuing to happen. And that's the reason why I say that even though Shakespeare in his black and white and Bollywood in its color seem worlds apart, they're every bit as much a Masala Jodi as Romeo and Juliet or Parma and Joya. Thank you very much. I think we've got time for about 2 questions, if there are questions. And no, I won't sing or dance anymore. Well, I might. There seems to be a question at the back there. Yep.
Hi, my name's Ashwin. You mentioned that this kind of a masala cinema is dying, but I would like to, it's a comment more than a question. I think I don't completely agree with you. While within the urban audience, I would say that with the advent of Netflix or Amazon Prime, we have grown towards sensible cinema, which often tends to be the opposite. But in movies like Gangs of Wasepur, you see that's not necessarily the case, where good filmmakers don't make masala films. I feel like while there is a certain type of growth in a certain direction, it doesn't mean that the other doesn't exist or is going down.
Well, let me say that I think there are still, but you're right, there are pockets in which masala still thrives. And I think the South is one, in fact. In December, I went to see Rajinikanth's latest film, then latest film, Talaiva, Peta. Right? And I thought this was the South's masala revenge on the North. It was such a typical Rajinikanth film in some ways. No matter what his politics are, the politics of the genre is a little bit different. It had about 25 introduction sequences for Rajinikanth. He kept entering. And at which point everyone would jump up in their seats and whistle and throw coins. I was sitting right behind a huge family who had brought their little baby. And every time Rajinikanth was introduced again on screen, they would raise the baby and take selfies with Rajinikanth. The poor baby was looking completely confused. But presumably he's going to grow up into a Talaiva, bhakt. But what was so interesting about this film, Rajinikanth was playing a warden at a boarding school in the north, where for some reason all the students speak Tamil. And at this boarding school, a Muslim kid is being bullied by a Christian kid. And Rajinikanth, Hindu warden, somehow manages to bring them together. And then the 3 of them join forces against this Saffron Bakht, played by, interestingly, Nawazuddin Siddiqui, who sends people, gundas out to beat up people on Valentine's Day, who is a sort of Gau Raksha type. And Rajinikanth prevails over this specter of intolerance, along with several hijras who are thrown in along the way. It seemed to me that this was a stirring endorsement of a certain kind of syncretic pluralism that actually we're seeing less and less in the North. So I am speaking here perhaps as a Hindi belt chauvinist. Tiger Shroff still makes masala films, but they're not masala in this way. They're dishum films. They're let's peer at Tiger Shroff's perfectly formed pectoral films. They're films about masculine aspiration. They're not like Salman Khan's Eid films. And no matter what you think of Salman Khan as a person, in terms of the films he's been making for Eid, these are over and over again masala films of the kind that I'm describing. They're beginning to disappear. So I fear that the venues in which the kind of multilingual syncretic collectivity that I believe Shakespeare had to perform for and that Hindi cinema for at least 5 decades was pitched at, we're receding from that a little bit. And we have to ask why. Is Shakespeare popular in England? Let me just say that the Shakespeare I see in England, I barely recognize as the Shakespeare I love. I think Shakespeare has sort of become canonized as a sort of secular version of scripture. And for heaven's sake, when you have institutions like the Royal Shakespeare Company, they do some very good productions, but so many people come to his productions with an attitude of reverence, as if they're going to Sunday school. You know, everyone knows the plays back to front, and they know when to laugh, ha 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 ha. They know when to look sad. But there isn't the sense of exhilarating collectivity in the audience. I always feel that the most important character in Shakespeare's plays doesn't appear in the play. It's the audience for whom Shakespeare's writing. That audience is now substantially different. It's by and large bourgeois, urban. Everyone else who goes to see Shakespeare tends to think that they won't understand Shakespeare, but they should. You know, it's like going to see the dentist. It's something you should do, but it's going to hurt. It was only when I came to India and when I saw Lagan in 2001 in a single-screen cinema hall, a light bulb went on over my head. When I saw Amir Khan, or rather Udit Narayan, providing the playback for Amir Khan's song Mitava. I didn't understand a word of Hindi at that point, but part of me could understand what was going on when Amir Khan sang Mitava. Mitava, sun Mitava, tujhko kya dar hai re, ye terti apni hai. That apni was really important. This land is ours. And who was the ours? Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Dalit, even Gora woman were included in the collectivity of that film. As crazy and unrealistic as the film is, I mean, do you really believe that a bunch of ragtag famished Indian villages are going to be English at cricket? Well, it held up a mirror, a very real mirror, to an idea of India. We are not one. We're not a Ram Rashtra, despite the decision today. We are many, and that is our strength. And it suddenly occurred to me, this is Shakespeare. This is Shakespearean. I was watching Anglophone people in the balcony. I was watching very poor people in the pit, jumping up in their seats, throwing coins at the screen, singing the songs along with Amir Khan. And I was thinking, something is happening here that is politically important. It may be of limited value, but it still holds up an ideal of pluralism that I think is receding now. I think Shakespeare can be our ally in trying to reclaim some of that, but only when he speaks in an Indian accent.